Hey guys, what I'm going to go over, I know I was looking at graphs and moving the aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply, and to show you a recessionary gap and an expansionary gap. Well, there's one curve that does it all, and it's called the Phillips curve. I wrote these notes a long time ago, and I was trying to explain when I came here to Waxahachie to my kids. I was writing in the middle of the night, and I started my notes off with high, so just bear with me. What we're going to be looking at is the Phillips curve. It is a graph that shows how the inflation rates and unemployment rates are related to each other in the short run and long run. Basically, the Phillips curve, it's not hard to understand because it's a reflection of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand. In the short run, there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, right? We know we only have inflation at one time or unemployment at one time. If we have both, we know we're in an abnormal contraction that's called stagflation. So we're going to look at the graph below. At point A, it shows an inflation rate, right, of 5% and 2% unemployment. So I know right here, if it's over 3%, I'm in an expansion. This is the expansion phase of the business cycle. At point B down here, it says our inflation is 1%. Well, that's lower than 3%. But unemployment is 8%. I know I'm in a contraction over here. All of this just was shifting on a curve. So let's look over here. I'm going to show you this point right here, the expansion, right? We saw it on our graph was an expansionary gap, right? But we had to draw all these curves out. There it is on one curve. Over here, this contraction. I had it graphed over here, right? It was a recessionary gap. All of it is in one point without all of that shifting. So, again, why is inflation low when unemployment's high? That's because when fewer people are working, there's less demand for goods and services, right? As a result, prices don't rise that fast. When unemployment gets lower, inflation gets higher because so many people have jobs and money to spend on stuff. Okay, so hopefully that was simple. Okay, my notes are upside down. I'm sorry, guys. Let me get that straight up for y'all. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at is the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph and the Phillips curve. And we're going to compare them. They have a lot in common. So we're going to look at the graphs on this page right here. I say the next page. What am I thinking? It's all on the same page. In the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph, a decrease, do y'all see this decrease right here? This decrease in aggregate demand moves that equilibrium point from A to point B. And so I know that I am having less real GDP and prices going down. So that tells me that this is a recession, right? Okay. The same change in the aggregate demand curve that caused the price level to fall and the real GDP fall causes inflation to fall, but unemployment to rise. Okay. This shift down that curve to show recession is in the opposite on the Phillips curve because this is inflation, right? And when we're in a recession, we don't have inflation, right? So that inflation we saw over here that was up here, it shifts downward on that Phillips curve. So these are the inverse. When you shift to the left with aggregate demand, you will shift down the Phillips curve to the right. Okay, got me? Okay. So whenever aggregate demand decreases, the price level falls and GDP falls. So that tells us we're in a recession. These causes inflation to fall and unemployment to rise, which is what we called a recession. On the graphs below, show how an increase in aggregate demand will look on both the aggregate supply model and the Phillips curve. Okay, so I want to show an increase in aggregate demand. So my curve will shift to the right. Here's AD2, right? So what has happened? Price has gone up, right? The price level has gone up. But what has happened to output, real GDP? Real GDP has gone up. So this tells me I'm in an expansion. And my problem in an expansion is that we have inflation, right? So over here on the Phillips curve, here is where my price level was low, but output was low. So unemployment was high. And now people are demanding stuff. So output is going to go up. People are going to have money. They're going to start demanding it, stuff. And all of a sudden, inflation's going to occur, right? And here's point B. Do we see how they are the inverse of each other? So now let's check our work. Here's the answers that I just graphed out. Great, I got it right. Hooray, that's good. Did you do it correctly? I guess we did do it correctly. If you're confused, ask someone that's really smart. I know we're not sitting in class next to each other. I was being facetious in this moment. But if you do have an issue about understanding aggregate demand and how these two graphs are the inverse of each other, email me, let's Zoom, let's something. Okay, so then the next thing is, can the Phillips curve move? Can it shift to the left and right? Yes, it can. Whenever something makes the short run aggregate supply curve shift to the left and right, then the Phillips curve will shift in the opposite direction. So over here, I have my short run aggregate supply curve. We know output is going up, right? Output is going up, so that tells me I'm in an expansion, right? Well, that happens over here too. It tells me expansion, okay? Because unemployment was high over here, now it's going down. So this is an expansion. So if there's okay, the next thing here is a contraction, right? Because we're making less stuff. And so here's my Phillips curve. In a contraction, we have higher unemployment, so it's coming out, and this is a contraction. So do you see a contraction with short run shifts to the left, contraction and Phillips shifts to the right? So now I know the dying question. Is there there's a short run Phillips curve, is there a long run? Yes. The long run Phillips curve shows the long run that there is no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. The long run Phillips curve exists at the economy's natural rate of unemployment, which is 5%, which is just so happens to correspond to the full employment of the long run aggregate supply. So the graph shows the long run Phillips curve at the economy's natural rate of unemployment, 5%, which I'm being redundant here, sorry guys. When the economy's natural rate of unemployment changes, so does the long run Phillips curve. So right now, we know that we're in a contraction. Our short run Phillips curve has shifted, right? It is shifted to the right. There is saying that there's almost 20% unemployment, right? And so in the long run, after we have more data, our Phillips curve will change with it. So when economy's natural rate of unemployment changes, so does the long run Phillips curve. When the long run Phillips curve tells us that policies change the level of the unemployment in the economy will ultimately result not only changes in the inflation rate. So our government knows that this Phillips curve is going to be shifting because in the short run, we have shifted it currently being way out here because unemployment is going up. And so now if we have several months of data and that Phillips curve then shifts away from that natural rate of unemployment, our government realizes it needs to enact policy. And that's what the government is doing right now. They're realizing in the long run, all of this data will come together saying that we have it above the rate of 5% and they're not going to be comfortable with that. So this is why the government has extended unemployment benefits. This is why the government has gone out there and they've given money to individual families. Okay. So we will be graphing some more, guys. See you soon.